September is World Suicide Prevention Month. And in keeping with this particular agenda, here at The Pill, we're going to be discussing prominent matters that deal with young people and what the youth in Zimbabwe are affected by. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Pill. I'm your host, Nadia Mtisi, and today in studio, I'm joined by Honourable Daniel Molokele. Our guest today sits in 3 different committees, that is in the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee. This is for higher and tertiary education, as well as for health and childcare, which are the most important topics that we're going to be discussing today. We think that because we have this particular guest today, our conversation is going to be broad, and we have an expert at whatever is going to be talking about today. Welcome to the studio, Honourable.
Thank you so much for hosting me. I'm happy to be here.
We're very happy that you're here. I think I've already said that this month is World Suicide Prevention Month, and this was commemorated on September 10. However, in Zimbabwe, we've seen a rise in terms of mental health concerns and students that have been taking their own lives due to a number of different issues. How does that make you feel as someone who's sitting in Parliament?
I think it's very sad, because remember that you are not just losing young people, you are losing young people who have potential to make a difference in the development spectrum of this country. Young people with brilliant minds, innovative minds, creative minds, who are a key source in terms of human resources. So we should prevent these deaths. Not even one death is necessary.
All right. I really like that you're saying that we should prevent these particular deaths. But what is Parliament doing, or what measures have been put in place to ensure that we don't lose more lives?
I think in terms of Parliament, we really need more to plug into this space, because as you are seeing, it's an increasingly negative trend. So the Parliament is a people's parliament. It responds to the situation on the ground. From a historical perspective, that such kind of suicide trends are very low. So I think we have to look at the Mental Health Act. We have to look at all other relevant legislation that speak to that, and make sure that Parliament responds. We can also look at the policy environment and look at the policies, especially in institutions for learning, and respond. So I think this is actually calling for a direct engagement between the key stakeholders, institutions for learning, and the Parliament of Zimbabwe.
That's very true. And as someone who's sitting in such a high post, what do you think are the reasons behind such a rise in these mental health concerns, a rise in suicide cases as well?
Thank you so much. At the risk of exposing how old I am, but I know I was at the University of Zimbabwe from 1995 to 1999. And we had issues of suicide at the UZ at that time. But from what I'm hearing, it looks like the numbers have changed. Today, they are much worse than they were at that time. And at the UZ in 1995, the main reason for suicide was maybe broken promises or relationships that did not work. But today, I think it's much more than that. And mainly because the social economic situation has changed. Can you imagine that when I left the UZ in 1999, I was actually very convinced 100% that the country's economy was horrible. But it's now over 20 years later, so I don't even know how to classify the situation. So social economically speaking, there's a lot of pressure on the university or college students. And at our time, we started in 1995 with full government grants, government loans, and then later they were reduced to 50%. But we actually had students supporting families or siblings back at home. So today is the other way around. The economy is not doing well, parents have no capacity to support, and then government is not providing support. So there is pressure to find ways. So you go into relationships that also create sustainability in terms of income. And that raises the stakes in terms of suicide and so on.
All right, that's a very, very valid point. But my question as well is, you mentioned that there were suicide cases even when you were in college. I want to ask on what was the way that society would view these particular things as compared to now, if you can make that comparison. So what was suicide, or what was mental health looked at in your day as compared to what is it like now? Because at least now we can actually have this conversation between a student and someone who's sitting in Parliament.
I think cases of suicide were very rare. So if a suicide case happened, there was no social media. People would whisper about it, people would express shock, and so on. And the student affairs at a department that was supposed to help with counseling and trauma, dealing with trauma issues. And students were encouraged to go there. But the cases were few and far between.
All right. Thank you very much. I think also we can look into sexual reproductive health matters that the Parliament was proposing that, the government allow for adolescents and for students or children that are not yet at the age of consent to be allowed to have access to sexual reproductive health services. And that was kind of shot down. Do you think there's somehow an interlink between sexual reproductive health matters and, we see a rise in these mental health concerns as well?
I sit in the Health and Childcare Committee, but in my other life, I was a civil society leader focusing on public health advocacy. So SRI, HRI issues are very important to me. I'm actually one of the leaders of a process that we are doing in Parliament of setting up a parliamentary caucus on population and development in SRI, HR. And I was one of the parliamentarians who are strongly supportive of increasing access to SRI, HR services, even for teenagers and adolescents, because we need to separate the issue of age of consent and the issue of access to healthcare services. I think in South Africa, many years ago, they agreed that if you turn 12, if not 13, you are allowed to access the healthcare without a guardian or whatever. So in Zimbabwe, we have a problem. We are failing to accept reality. Because, for example, contraception can make a difference in defining the career of a young person or the future. And also there's a little bit of patriarchy, because when things happen, they are most likely to affect the girl child or the females more than the males, especially when we talk about pregnancy. And it's important that we protect them, especially if we talk about abortion or termination of pregnancy. So we need to change the laws, including the Termination of Pregnancy Act, to be more flexible, to protect the future of young people, especially the female students.
I'm so glad that you've raised that today, Honourable, because in my time at UZ, I'm in second year right now, so I've only been at UZ for about 2 years, but there've been a number of cases where girls have died because they're trying to, terminate a pregnancy or something of the sort. And so I definitely agree that it's time that we reevaluate some of our statutes that are in place in terms of sexual reproductive health, and even when it comes to termination of pregnancy. But let's also look at the issue of relationships, which we have mentioned is one of the biggest factors contributing to, people then getting to the edge and committing suicide, right? What do you think? I mean, let's look at in your time. You've already mentioned that there were people that were, committing suicide because of heartbreak and a number of different issues. In my day, everyone is laughing on social media saying Jolo, the pandemic and all of that stuff. And it's very real. We might be laughing about it, but it truly is a pandemic. So could you just take us into the dating scene in your time? What was it like? I'm sure you mentioned that, suicide rates were not as high as they are now. But in your time, what was it like? And what do you think is happening in these relationships that is leading to, people then having a dip in their mental health and then committing suicide?
Yeah, I think even at my time at UZ, the stakes were always high. I actually know that my wife was a medical student, and she lost one of her classmates who was in a relationship with a fellow classmate. And when they broke up, the female student committed suicide. And those cases were there. But people were looking at relationships from a long-term point of view, like marriage. At the UZ today, and indeed in many institutions of higher learning, most of these relationships have nothing to do with long-term perspectives. They have nothing to do with marriage. They are what we call transactional relationships, where someone is worried about food, or someone is worried about accommodation. So what they say, there is no romance without finance. It affects this particular instance where it's seen as an opportunity to finance yourself. So, we've also had the concept of the blessers and blesses. Yes. And so these kind of relationships are always short-term. And so the stakes are now higher because people see them as a profitable option, not as a social option. And I think the situation today has been worsened by the rise of social media. Remember, I started my degree and finished it without even owning a cell phone. I didn't even have a laptop. I didn't have any computer. So technology has changed, and social media has become a big factor. And hashtags, trends, those things didn't exist at my time at UZ. So that is also worsening the context.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I love that you're mentioning that in some sort of way, because of the kind of society we're living in now, everything is boiling down back to the economy. And so I think you've mentioned that social media is putting pressure on students, that there's financial burden on students, that you're not seeing a relationship as I might get married to this person, but I can get some clothes to wear, I can pay my school fees and all of that stuff. We've seen such an alarming rise in terms of these suicide cases and alarming concerns in terms of mental health. What do you think can be done by Parliament, and what do you think can be done by society, by parents, by friends, to try and mitigate that?
I think as a parliamentarian, obvious, we need public engagement process, consultation. But beyond that, we need to see whether we can change policies in institutions for higher learning. We can also change conditionalities in terms of counseling services, to say that each institution should have a proper structure, proper staffing, proper skills and experts. And also the budget system should be redesigned in such a way that more resources are allocated towards psychosocial support and so on. So that will then help. And also that more resources are allocated towards awareness, so that people know that when they're in this situation, they can get help. Maybe hotlines should be set up, call centers where people can even be cancelled online and so on. So we need to invest more towards also teaching people that mental health is real, issues around mental health are real. So issues around depression are real. So we need to accept them as a society. We should not stigmatize them. We need to embrace them and reduce the risk of someone committing suicide, because most people commit suicide, they do not do it sort of suddenly. It takes time, it builds up. And if there is no support, it ends up there.
All right. And in terms of your advice to maybe parents and people that we're in direct connection with as well, just as a general person, what would you say is something that we can do as maybe an ordinary person in society to try and also mitigate the rise of suicide and the rise of mental health concerns?
Yeah, I think the first and foremost, we must stop making a joke. It's not a joke. It's something sad and serious.
That's true.
Something tragic. So let's stop laughing. Let's stop taking things lightly. And then let's also find ways to provide support. Maybe set up peer groups or set up support groups where people can share their experiences and support each other. Let's set up hotlines where people can talk in private, anonymously and so on, where people can ventilate and release the tension. At the end of the day, let's also have public awareness campaigns to make sure that people are aware that they should not stigmatize. The way we fought HIV and AIDS, the way we are busy fighting COVID-19 today, information empowers people, knowledge empowers people. And let's make sure that there's a right approach in terms of the response. What is there today can be improved, especially social attitudes should change towards depression or mental health issues or towards suicide. We need to change.
That's a very amazing answer. I love the fact that you mentioned that the same way that we fought other diseases before is the same way that the same amount of pressure that we must also apply when it comes to trying to mitigate these mental health concerns that are rising within our society. Honourable, in keeping with the idea of the policy that was shot down by government that was allowing adolescents, or that was allowing children that are below the age of consent to have access to social and reproductive health services, because that was shot down, what then is the plan B? What are we going to do to ensure that they still have that particular access, or to ensure that something is put in place to protect them?
Okay, so I said that I have a civil society background in public health advocacy. So I was very disappointed when things did not turn out the way I would have wanted. But we also should understand that change is a process. It's not a revolution. In this particular context, we need to emphasize more on advocacy on the ground. Because Parliament is a people's parliament. It must not impose new policies, new laws. It must respond to the changes. Society is dynamic. Traditions change, culture change. And we had a situation in South Africa, and we couldn't import it into Zimbabwe because these countries are not the same socially, economically speaking. So we need to go back to the drawing board and emphasize more on awareness and advocacy. And hopefully in not so distant future, this issue will come back. Remember, there was a lot of emotions. There was a lot of propaganda out there. Some religious people, cultural people, they went there, they threw toys out of their prams. So there was a lot of emotions. People were saying, we're now exposing our children to STIs and so on. So that's where the politicians, including the Minister of Health, they were responding to the outrage that was out there.
All right, that makes a lot of sense. So what you're saying is that the social consciousness of the general populace has to change for Parliament to even then be able to implement that particular system. You mentioned issues of advocacy, and what do you think that looks like on the ground? Does that look like people speaking about it? Does that look like TV shows? Does that look like radio shows? How exactly on the ground can people then contribute, like practical examples?
I think the good news is that we're busy licensing community radio stations. Hopefully, we'll have more television and radio to compete with the state monopoly, the ZBC. But we also know that through social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook, we can now access a lot of populations. But we also need to do that with the radio and television. So let's use that. Let's have town hall meetings. Let's have community level workshops, rural, township. That's where social consciousness is needed. Most of the people who are a bit educated, who are middle class, will be more open-minded. But on the ground, especially in rural areas, where patriarchy is still strong, such debates will be even regarded as taboo. So we need to work hard, even with the traditional leaders. We need to work hard.
That makes a lot of sense. I read a book by Melinda Gates, The Moment of Lift, and she basically talks about how the pill can literally revolutionize the lives of women all around the world. And I love that we're having this conversation because this is one of the things that she was basically speaking about in that particular book. In your own thinking, Honourable, do you think there is a nexus between denying this particular age group sexual and reproductive health services to the rise of mental health concerns?
It's obvious there's a nexus because we have a situation where an opportunity arose to interrogate and see the reality on the ground. And it was open and shut case. So there was no capacity for the younger generation to share their side of the story. They were literally closed out in terms of the national discourse. So what is the other option? When you cannot ventilate as a generation, when adults, somewhat double age or triple age, tell you their moral values and impose them on you. So there is obviously going to be a situation where the younger generation feels that society is rejecting their version of the reality that they are facing every day. And suicide becomes an option because you see that all around you, people are not listening to you.
That makes a lot of sense. But I also have a question on this whole idea of knowing that the biggest population in Zimbabwe is obviously young adults and it's obviously the youth, right? But then when you then say that this thing was not able to go through or the policy was not able to go through because of the sentiments of the general population, who then is the general population? The adults who then impose their values on young people, or the young people themselves who are basically saying that we want this to be taken into consideration?
Remember that when you're talking about adolescence, you're talking about school-going age.
That's
so they're
true.
Under guardianship, they're under parentage. So when you're having public hearings, when you're having public debate, they are all, due to the nature of society, they are all shut down. When you are still at school, you are not allowed to go into a public debate. And and the parents or guardians overwhelm you. So the general population in the context of the debate are parents and guardians. But in terms of the population of the country, a demographic analysis will confirm what is obvious. Africa is a very young continent, and Zimbabwe is a good example of a country in Africa where the majority of the people are less than 40 years. They are less than 35 years. The population of Zimbabwe is very young. So in the policy formulation processes, in legislative making processes, there are few youths in strategic leadership position. There was a recent constitutional amendment which created a youth quota. I'm totally opposed to that amendment because it sort of is a facade. It covers the reality on the ground. Youth are already more than 65% of the population of this country. Why should there be 10% of them in parliament? Because their views will not be heard. We've got people who are triple the age of the majority average age of this country. So their views are way back to 1960 when they were youth, to 1950 when they were youth. So some of them stopped being youth by 1970. They are grandparents, but they are the ones making, look at the age group of parliament, the average age of parliamentarians today.
That makes a lot of
sense. They are not related to the reality of the majority of the population. So our parliament is not youthful enough. And that issue is related to the issue of gender, which is also related to the issue of patriarchy. So some of this moralist approach is strongly related on the patriarchal system, where when issues of SRA, HR come aboard, they look at it from the point of view that most young boys or young men are not as affected as females or young women. So the patriarchal component is very strong, because the moralist approach, at the end of the day, it protects the boys, it protects the young men, and it exposes the girls and the females.
Wow, that's an amazing point. I think you've literally covered everything. There's tokenism that is taking place, and the voices of women and the voices of the youth are not being heard. I think we've already spoken about how there needs to be policy transformation and policy change at almost all levels. And I think you've raised amazing, immaculate points. I think
remember on the issue of gender, I actually say the constitution of the country, the 2013 constitution, is very clear.
Yes.
That our vision is to achieve 50%. So what is there today is less than 13%. So with the youth, it could be less than 10%. So the youth are more than 50%, but they are actually less than 10% in strategic key decision-making processes. So when you go to Parliament of Zimbabwe and you look for someone who's 20-something years old, you will use one hand like this, and you will not be able to go through the 5 fingers.
All right.
That is a tragic.
Very
more
tragic.
than 65% of the population is less than 30 years old. So there is a clear disjunction between the majority of the population and those who are making decisions about the future. Most of them will not be there in 2063. They won't be there in 2050. So we really need to push for more than at least 50% women, 50% youth. Then I will be relaxed. For now, it's really unfair. It's too patriarchal. It's too old.
This is an amazing point, and I'm so glad that you're raising this, because it's something that we don't hear, particularly in Zimbabwe. I remember at one point I was asked to do an interview, and I spoke about how there was patriarchy even at the UZ. Just in our class, when we mentioned things about women getting into power and all of that stuff, you get a lot of backlash, and people said, "Oh, you're trying to be a pick-me. That's not happening anywhere." But I'm so glad that someone who's in such a position as yourself is able to say that, and also is able to, be a forerunner of the next great movement that is also inclusive of the youth and of women.
I think it's possible that there's some spirituality involved, but also from a mental health point of view, in the traditional African analysis, there is an assumption that witchcraft is involved. But a problem of depression that can be clinically tested and verified, but people just assume it is witchcraft. So we need awareness. We need to make sure that people understand that mental health issues are real, apart from the issues around spirituality. Because in the African traditional analysis, people did not understand the concept of mental health. It didn't actually exist. So if you have mental health issues, it's just equated to madness, and that's it. Depression didn't even exist. When it can be clinically verified and tested.
I'd like to personally thank you for being on The Pill today. You've raised amazing points, and I think that the youth that are listening into this show today are able to be inspired. If you're a young lady out there who's looking to get into politics, now is the time for you to look into getting into politics. If you're out there, if you're a mental health advocate, now is the time for you to speak up and speak loud about whatever is happening in your society or in your community. There are amazing people such as Honourable Molokele who are here to, speak up for us as the youth, and who also were able to proffer amazing advice that we can also take into consideration. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been your host. My name is Nadia Mutisi. Join us next time here on The Pill.